Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, can you tell us what the time split is here now?
The gentleman from Michigan has 50 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Washington has 44 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gunderson.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gunderson, is recognized for 3 minutes.
And I yield to my colleague from New York for unanimous consent request.
I thank my colleague very much and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, Mr. Speaker. I have thought long and hard on this issue and have sought out information from those in and out of the Congress close to this issue. And I sense this year a significant change in the debate. The realities of the Sandinistas are now universally recognized. To reduce the debate, as I understand it, to its essentials is how to achieve a negotiated settlement. On the one hand, we are told that the neighboring countries in Central America will achieve it on their own. I happen to believe that is unrealistic, and that we will need the military support to back up our diplomatic and political efforts. I thank you.
I appreciate the gentleman's remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I have never voted for military assistance for Nicaragua. I have always believed that we ought to allow every country in Central America the right to self-determination. But let's make no mistake about it today, there is no self-determination in Central America. Nicaragua is exporting revolution to almost every country. And so look at the alternatives before us. To do nothing is wrong, but to pursue the road of a total military solution is also wrong. But today we come before you with the President's executive order and a compromise. That compromise gives us this long-term program based on a bipartisan consensus and premised on negotiations. The compromise does not include new money. It reprograms present defense money. It provides insufficient funds to achieve a military victory, if anyone believes that's the President's alternative, and it's premised on negotiations, where after 75 days the President reports back to this Congress and we have a chance to stop military aid at that point in time if we don't believe those negotiations are going forth. Most important, if you believe in negotiations, if you believe we ought to stop the killing in Nicaragua, under this compromise agreement it is all put in the hands of Mr. Ortega. All he has to do is, number one, declare a ceasefire, number two, enter into internal negotiations in his country, and number three, lift the emergency rule. If he alone does those three things, there will never be $1 of offensive military weapons from the United States going to the Contras in Nicaragua. If you want peace, if you want a long-term policy, if you want bipartisan consensus, if you want negotiations, if you want to stop the killing, ladies and gentlemen, the compromise the President agreed to, we ought to agree to it as well. I encourage you to vote aye.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Leach.
The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Leach, is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I would like briefly to address the issue of compromise. That proposed by the President would appear to be of a tactical variety, consequential perhaps in dealing with Congress, but of limited significance to constraining the administration's intended policies. The only kind of compromise this member would consider credible would be one precluding the provision of military-related assistance to armed interveners in the region, and one requiring administration reacceptance of the jurisdiction of the World Court in issues of this nature. After all, what is at stake in these deliberations relates less to the irrational decisions of a leftward-lurching government in a small area of Central America, and more to the constitutional process of decision-making here at home and to the rule of law in our policy abroad. Given the preemptive executive decision to commence without congressional sanction a civil war in Nicaragua, the Congress is placed in the difficult position of having to determine which is a greater misdeed: pulling the rug from armed mercenaries who are trained and equipped in violation of U.S. law and who are currently marauding a countryside in violation of international law, or pulling the rug from the values we cherish as profoundly American: the sanctity of law, the rights of others to determine their own destiny in their own way, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Liberals may have erred by believing the Sandinistas would not opt in the direction of police-state controls, but our country nevertheless has an obligation to stand by the side of law with the understanding that not only do procedural concerns matter, but that adherence to proper rules in the long run are more likely to produce proper results. There is simply no evidence the United States is very good at running a Civil War-oriented foreign policy. The time has come to reconsider an ill-chosen path. It is better to cut bait now than to troll into waters whose depths are unfathomable, whose currents are uncontrollable. Prudence dictates restraint.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Colby.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes. 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Minnesota for unanimous consent agreement.
Consent revised and extend my remarks in support
Without
of the
objection,
resolution.
so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise today near the close of this lengthy debate with the full knowledge that almost everything has been said. It is good, not only for this body, but for our country to have a full and vigorous discussion of an issue of this magnitude. There is room for legitimate disagreement in a democracy, and I would hope that none of us on either side of this issue would question the motives, the integrity, or the patriotism of our colleagues who may differ with us. I stand here today in the hope that I might bring a slightly different perspective to this issue. I was undecided on this question until the beginning of this week. I did oppose military aid that was requested last year. Now I have come to a different conclusion, in part because of a visit I made to the region over the weekend. But let me make one point very clear. I don't believe one goes to Nicaragua for 24 hours and comes back knowing everything or seeing everything only in shades of black and white. I went to Nicaragua on the razor edge of decision and returned nudged to one side. So what did I see and hear that caused me to decide that military assistance is the best alternative available? Yes, I did see Soviet helicopter gunships, but no, I didn't see Cuban pilots or Soviet technicians. But I did meet with Vice President Sergio Ramirez. In answer to my direct question, he said there were virtually no circumstances short of surrender that his government would ever negotiate with the opposition forces in his country. We met with Bishop Obando y Bravo. He did not wave the American flag or sing our national anthem, but he did tell us in vivid terms how the Catholic Church is being persecuted in his country and his fear that Nicaraguans will not be permitted to express their religious beliefs. We met with business and labor leaders. No, they didn't tell us they want to replicate the U.S. economic model in Nicaragua, but they did say they want free labor unions and the right to make choices in the marketplace. I returned from this visit with a couple of impressions that I want to share with my colleagues. One, there are no simple, no clear-cut moral choices in Central America. The opposition forces in the field are not the ideal opposition, but it strikes me as paradoxical to suggest that we shouldn't train these forces because they are ill-disciplined and have committed acts outside the accepted rules of warfare. Training and aid could change that. Two, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua is a hardcore Marxist-Leninist regime, and no amount of whitewash will cover that up. Even the slight bow to democracy with opposition political parties and the vestige of a free press is entirely consistent with that conclusion. They are a threat to our stability, and we have every right to be concerned with that. Third, if we don't give aid, we won't have this debate next year. That conclusion is a stark one, but an inevitable one. 2 years with no military assistance pitted against literally hundreds of millions of dollars of arms and weapons that have flowed from Cuba and the Soviet Union has left the opposition forces on the ropes. It is now, this year, or not at all. Mr. Chairman, when we visited with President Duarte of El Salvador on our way home...
Mr. Chairman, could we have order? We don't have much time left on this
The gentleman
issue.
will suspend. Committee will be in order. Those members engaged in conversation will desist and take seats. Gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when we visited with President Duarte of El Salvador, he told us that the Nicaraguan experience has accelerated the democratic process in Latin America, that the domino theory of democracy is sweeping this region of the world. The question that we must ask ourselves is simply this: will the domino of democracy fall across Nicaragua?
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If all of the statements that we have heard today are true and correct, and I doubt that they are, we are still faced with the inevitable fact that 3 months ago I joined with a majority in this body to say that we should enter into serious deficit reduction matters. We face a national debt of $2 trillion, and we are paying next year $150 billion interest on that national debt. Not one speaker who have proposed the transfer or expending of this $100 million to a Central American insurgent conflict has told us where we are going to get the money. We're going to get the money by borrowing it the way they have every other dollar of foreign and military aid. And I say that if they say the money exists, there are many, many places in America that this money could be spent. What does $100 million mean to your congressional district? Let me tell you, my friends, that it means $1,000 per contra, but in my district alone, I have 31,700 unemployed Americans. It would mean something to them. It would restore revenue sharing for a total of 12 years in any one of our districts. It would restore trade adjustment, UDAG, CDs, EDAs, and on I could go.
The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Robinson.
The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Robinson, is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, my time is very limited, so I want to quickly preface my remarks by thanking all of my constituents back home that have been so sincere in sharing their viewpoints over the past several weeks. I also want to thank my colleagues on both sides for being sincere throughout this debate. Notwithstanding the sincerity of this great body, however, some today want to cast their vote to make Daniel Ortega cry uncle, while others want to cast their vote to make the President of the United States cry uncle by making him come back in April for another vote. Well, today I want to associate my remarks with a different type of uncle. I want to talk about Uncle Sam and what this vote and who this vote really stands for. The whole world is watching us today to see whether or not, once again, we will, in a very weak-kneed way, back off and not do what we know in our hearts is right. I have a 17-year-old son, and on this day in 1896, the Marines landed in Nicaragua.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
On this day in 1986, I'm going to vote yes to keep my son out of Nicaragua. Thank you.
Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Lloyd.
Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Lloyd, is recognized for 2 minutes.
In my remarks.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote against H.J. Res. 540 today so that we can allow consideration of an alternative policy that we can debate and legislatively bound on this issue. You know, more than 160 years ago, John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, drafted a document which is the heart of our discussion today. This document was the Monroe Doctrine. It was a simple message, and it was a simple warning. That was that the Americans, the United States of America, would take an active interest in the American hemisphere. And this warning is really what we're debating today, that we will not tolerate the intervention of foreign powers in our own backyards. If we're going to assist in bringing to an end the conflict in Central America, if we're going to end the threat of communism, then what steps are best? What steps are necessary? I think that's the real issue, what is best for America, not whether we're against or for the president. I think it's in the best interest of America to work out a compromise that would allow for any military assistance provided for the Contras to be fenced in for a brief period, perhaps 30 to 45 days. This would allow sufficient time for President Duarte to pursue his peace initiative and press for a regional summit. However, should the negotiations not occur, should the Nicaraguans refuse to participate in diplomatic process, then our process, our response, should be automatic. Once the time period has passed, the President should be free to certify the release of Contra aid funds approved by the Congress. Last Saturday morning, Mr. Chairman, I met with President Ascona of Honduras. I asked him for his views on the delays, and his response was direct. He said a small period of waiting after any legislation is passed would be very helpful for the negotiations of a political settlement with Nicaragua. President Ascona was frank and to the point. While preoccupied with the internal situation, he expressed his concern. I urge my colleagues to vote no and to vote for the alternative.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Skelton. 5 minutes.
Gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Skelton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Would the gentleman yield for unanimous consent request?
I will yield.
I thank the gentleman. The most important critical ingredient in any political movement is the composition and identity of the men who lead it. The United Nicaraguan Opposition, who they are and where do they come from. I ask unanimous consent that my statement be entered in the record.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Will the gentleman yield for unanimous?
I yield the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you. I thank my colleague. I urge bipartisan support for the President's proposed compromise. I'd like unanimous consent for my remarks to be inserted into the record at this point.
The gentleman, without objection, the gentleman can revise and extend his remarks.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the proposal that is before us today. I do so as one who voted for the humanitarian aid the last time and against the military assistance the last time. I do so based upon the agreement that has been worked out with others, especially the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Chandler, and myself. And I do this because it is a workable solution to the problem that is ahead of us. It's based upon a proposed executive order. We asked for certain things to be addressed, and they were addressed. We ask about human rights. We ask about negotiations, having a last chance. We ask about humanitarian aid and holding off military aid for 90 days. And during that 90 days, we suggested that there be training and, of course, air defense. We asked for a commitment to Central America and to a policy based upon the Henry Jackson report. We also asked that all resistance forces be included. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, this is what we have accomplished. We want to give negotiations one more chance, and this we have succeeded in having. I would be remiss if I did not say at this juncture that the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. McCurdy, was very helpful in this work. He and I agree on so many aspects of it, disagreeing, I believe, on the vehicle in which we have reached the same goal. I'd like to very briefly review what we have accomplished in the negotiations and agreement with the White House. That humanitarian assistance would be given immediately, and that other assistance would be withheld for 90 days following approval of this request. That immediately equipment and supplies for defense against air attack would be supplied. That support for democratic, political, and diplomatic activities be given. That immediate training be given. And that following the 90-day period, additional types of assistance would be provided to the Nicaraguan Democratic Assistance only if it's been determined after consultation with Congress that the Central American countries have not concluded a comprehensive agreement, that the government of Nicaragua is not engaged in serious dialogue, and there's no reasonable prospect of achieving these developments through further diplomatic measures, and that there has been a report to Congress. And also that there is a commission established to make the reports to the Congress on a bipartisan basis. We've also included in this an agreement to require an assistance to human rights. And also we have stopped receive of any assistance to those who violate human rights or involve themselves in drug smuggling. This is one that involves an equal proportion of assistance to the Indian groups as well as to BOSS. Mr. Chairman, this body seems polarized on this issue, but it's not the first time that this body has been polarized over Central America. The first time was back in the early 1800s when Henry Clay was the Speaker. The great decision at that time was whether to endorse freedom from the Spanish rule for those countries in Central and South America. And after long and great bitter debate, the House came down on the side of freedom for those countries. We set a precedent then, and it's been maintained ever since.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Washington.
When do you want me to go?
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Kentucky 3 minutes. Mr.
Gentleman
Hubbard.
from Kentucky, Mr. Hubbard, is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, some of those who are very enthusiastic about $100 million in aid to the Contras in Nicaragua like to paint the opponents as liberal Democrats or liberal Republicans who are apparently not worried about the spreading of communism throughout Central America. This congressman is a Democrat who frequently votes with President Reagan and who met with the President in the Oval Office last Wednesday for 25 minutes. I should say Wednesday of last week. I'm a Democrat who genuinely likes and admires our President. Some of you consider this Kentucky Democrat a hawk on defense issues, and I am. I represent Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, and several of my constituents are employed at Fort Knox, Kentucky. If this country ever goes to war again, among the most valued troops first to be called upon would be those from Fort Campbell and Fort Knox, Kentucky. Last Sunday night, my wife Carol and I watched with interest President Reagan's speech. The whole awkward rationale for the $100 million in aid for the Contras was summed up in a few arresting sentences. I quote our President last Sunday night. Clearly, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact have grasped the stakes involved, the strategic importance of Nicaragua. The Soviets have made their decision to support the communists. Fidel Castro has made his decision to support the communists. Arafat, Gaddafi, and the Ayatollah Khomeini have made their decision to support the communists. Now we must make our decision. Well, an elderly lady at Beaver Dam, Kentucky asked me last Monday morning, gee whiz, Congressman, are Arafat, Gaddafi, and the Ayatollah really concerned about Nicaragua? Let's be serious. If I thought the United States were actually faced with the kind of armed threat and refugee invasion pictured by our President, I assure you that $100 million in aid to these Contras waging a losing battle in Nicaragua would not be appropriate for us to be considering today. The use of United States troops would be the issue of today if our security in the United States were indeed actually threatened. The foreign ministers of 8 Latin American nations, the Contadora Group, visited with Secretary of State George Shultz here in Washington last month to ask that their Contadora process be given a chance to work. The nations at the meeting were Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Uruguay. These 8 countries plead with you and me today here in the Congress to give the pursuit of the Contadora process a chance to bring about a meaningful, lasting peace in Central America. My colleagues, this is my 12th year in the House of Representatives. During all of this time and through 7 administrations, Fidel Castro led a communist regime just 90 miles from Key West, Florida. They haven't attacked us yet. No one advocates sending $100 million in military and economic aid to Castro Cubans. Let's establish economic improvements and not war in Central America so that democracy will be the chosen form of government in Nicaragua and all of Central America. Please vote no today.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 5 minutes to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murtha.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murtha, is
I
recognized
yield
for
to the
5
gentleman
minutes.
from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in support of the pending resolution to provide.
Please.
To provide military assistance and other assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, I'd like to say by way of preface here that all of us recognize that there are deeply and sincerely held differences of opinion on how to approach this matter. I take no issue with any of my colleagues. I have certainly no quarrel with the rationale by which they try to solve this dilemma. I reach my decision based on my own conclusion, observations, and analyses. In the last administration, I was one of the leaders to help put through a program of assistance to the new government in Nicaragua to try to help undo 40 years of misery with which the United States had a little bit of something to do, and I'm not ready to give us all of the blame. But nevertheless, it was an unfortunate experience. There were people in the hills then for years and years and years who had fought against the dictatorship of Somoza. And when a new government came in, all of those people who were part of the revolution of Somoza thought a new day had come, that here finally was the opportunity to bring democratic processes to the people of Nicaragua. And those of us who went there at that time, who took a lead in this House to extend the hand of friendship to that new government, found out very quickly where that government was coming from. They cut us off at about the elbow, is where it was. Their concern was not for democratic processes or carrying out their statements on which the revolution was predicated, but simply to consolidate communist power. I guarantee you they followed the handbook, paragraph by paragraph, on how you consolidate communist power in a given territory over the people, subjugate them, and get rid of all of your opposition. The people who fought and were part of the revolution against Somoza and started out being part of the new government in Nicaragua were frozen out. They had to quit. Their whole being was shattered by virtue of the fact that the revolution they had fought for had been subverted beyond any question. That is my conclusion also, after having talked to every single member of the directorate, both down there and up here. It is my conclusion also, after having talked to every single member of the junta, and having talked to the leaders of all of the democratic elements that were part of the fight to get rid of Somoza. And they all say, unanimously, we did not fight to get rid of Somoza to wind up with a communist government subjugating our people once again. And where are those leaders? They're out in the hills again. They're called all kinds of names, Contras, counter-revolutionaries, whatever you want to call them. But the first guy was Pastora, and he fought Somoza with a ragtag outfit, had no support from anybody. People said he would never win and whatnot, but he was part of that revolution. He was part of the new government. He is back in the hills fighting again. And he told me personally, I'll fight for as long as it takes, with or without anybody's help, because this is not what I fought for. This is not what the Nicaraguan people are entitled to. They're entitled to something better than that. Robelo the same way. Calero the same way. Cruz the same way. All of the people that were part of that government. And even though one of the principal families in Nicaragua is split right down the middle, today, the thing that really brought about...
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman to Pennsylvania 1 additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 additional minute.
Continue to yield the gentleman.
was the assassination of Chamorro, who ran the Free Press. Now, ever since that time when we had to finally cut off our assistance in trying to be friendly with this new government, establish a new relationship, absolutely nothing has happened in terms of democratic processes, with or without force, with or without diplomacy. I've come to the conclusion the only way we're going to get any kind of talk at all, if indeed we can, is to go the two-track approach, and to do that, military assistance in a serious way is absolutely essential. That's where I ultimately come down. In conclusion, let me say, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, unfortunately, there'll be no victory here today by 1 vote or 2 votes or 3 votes or whatever it is. This issue is here before us for a long time. And if the country's divided and the Congress is divided, you cannot have a long-term policy to solve the issue. The issue is not going to go away. The issue is, will we have democracy in Nicaragua? We have to do our best to start now to help bring it there.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Washington.
May I inquire how much time remains?
Would the gentleman repeat his statement?
May I inquire how much time remains on each side?
The gentleman has 36 minutes, and on the minority side, there remains 32 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield for unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Moody.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise to, in opposition to the resolution before us today, and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, it's
I
so
yield
ordered.
for unanimous consent request to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Dowd.
I make the same request, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
I yield for unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Fussell, and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Alexander.
The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Alexander, is recognized for 1 minute.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Chairman and members, I am touched by the sincerity of the debate today and the high level of information that is imparted by our members, and especially the previous speaker from Florida, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I will say to him that I oppose this resolution, but I agree with many of the things that he has said. I, too, went to Nicaragua in 1980 as an emissary to meet with all of the factions, many of whom have talked with me since. I have a letter here, which I will submit for the record, by Edgar Chamorro, who is a Nicaraguan. He opposed Somoza. He later joined the FDN. He is a Contra. He became disillusioned with the Contras because, in his words, in his letter, he says that the Contras do not represent a viable military force, a successful political project, nor an appropriate means for reaching U.S. foreign policy goals in Central America. And a former Contra says that ultimately it is the Nicaraguans themselves who must resolve this problem. And we must put faith in pluralism and democracy to allow it to work in that region.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, what's the division on time now?
Gentleman has 32 minutes remaining.
What is the?
The gentleman from Washington has 35.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Klinger.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Klinger, is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I have been one of those who has been undecided on this issue, and if anything, I was leaning in opposition to the aid. On the one hand, I think I have recognized, along with most of my colleagues, that the Sandinista regime is increasingly repressive, has been consolidating its power and suppressing all civil rights in that country. I've been disturbed also by the hard evidence that we have that Nicaragua is indeed a breeding ground, a training ground for terrorists throughout the Western Hemisphere and indeed throughout the world. I have been extremely concerned about the potential threat to vital sea lanes in the Caribbean if the Soviets are permitted to establish a submarine base there. On the other hand, I have been convinced that there can be no permanent solution, no permanent resolution without the support of the Contadora and the support groups in Central and South America. They want a diplomatic resolution. They're calling for a diplomatic resolution. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I welcome the offer the President is making to us today. We have his commitment, the commitment of the President of the United States, to withhold offensive weapons from the Contras while aggressively pursuing a diplomatic resolution. Mr. Chairman, I think that we need to take this opportunity. The prospects for successful negotiations are greatly enhanced by the threat of military aid if we fail. By the same token, if we fail, I'm convinced that our good faith and aggressive efforts to bring peace will rally the support of the other nations. Let us do this and keep the flame of
Time
freedom
of the gentleman has expired.
in Nicaragua from guttering and going out.
The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Jacobs.
The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Jacobs, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I speak to all of the American people, and according to the polls, I speak for 58% of the American people. You need not wait until tomorrow to read this debate. You can read it on every day of the congressional record during the Vietnam War. You can read the same debate in the Lebanon blunder. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Coughlin, has quoted President Reagan as saying, absolutely, no Americans will be sent, no American flyers, etc. Let me read you a quotation from President Reagan on October 25, 1962, just in case you're interested to know what the President will do when this so-called Contra force fails, as everybody in this chamber knows it must fail on its own with or without our aid. Can any of us deny, this is what President Reagan said when he was, I guess, governor, when we abandoned the 1,500 Cuban fighters in the Bay of Pigs, that we turned our back on their suffering and the fact that they were dying in prison because we were willing to sacrifice honor in order to avoid unpleasantness. What a euphemism for the slaughter of our young men which took place in Lebanon to save this country at its vital hour of need, in Vietnam, in World War I, to save the world for democracy. Mr. Chairman, and the 58% of the American people who have learned the lesson of history, if this country ever goes to war or gets involved in a war again, let it be because we have to, not just because we have a chance to. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Henry.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, during the last recent task force excursion to Central America, I was one of the 9 members who had an opportunity to meet with Nicaraguan Vice President Sergio Ramirez Mercado. I asked him during that meeting why Nicaragua was the only Central American government unwilling to sign the Conadora II treaty proposal. His direct response was, and I quote verbatim, "We won't get anywhere if we debate this issue. I want simple answers to simple questions. Why then should we release these funds as immediately as possible? First, to add pressure to the efforts to seek a negotiated settlement in the face of such intransigence. Secondly, to add risk viability to those who courageously resist this regime, be it militarily or in the civil resistance. But there is yet an even more important consequence and significance to our vote on this matter today. In Central America, we have the tale of 2 cities, of 2 nations who have experienced 2 very different types of resolution. And the differing character of each of these revolutions has a profound impact on the current struggle between those committed to and those opposed to the dream of freedom for the Latin American peoples. These 2 revolutions are as strikingly different today as the English Revolution of the 17th century and the French Revolution of the 18th century. In the one, as in El Salvador, the necessity of mediating social change through democratic political institutions is recognized as central to the ultimate character of its final result. In the other, as in Nicaragua, the end is elevated above the means, and the liberators have subsequently become the new oppressors. Mr. Speaker, our constituents are not particularly sensitive to the critical nature of this distinction.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Mavroulis.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Mavroulis, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. Profound changes have come about in Latin America during the last decade, and these changes have come through peaceful means. They've been brought about by ballots and not by bullets. This map here this morning This map, distributed by our State Department, vividly portrays the massive movement throughout this hemisphere toward democratic societies. 10 years ago, most of the southern tilt of our hemisphere was dominated by military dictatorship of the right or the left. They are portrayed in brown. Today, by patient application of peaceful dialogue and constitutional process, 90% of the inhabitants of Latin America live under constitutional systems. Mr. Chairman, one of these changes was brought about by United States military intervention, not by our financing violent overthrow of existing governments. I don't have the time. Our Latin American friends tell us that they would have been counterproductive. The people who live in these democracies insist that we can help the cause of democracy not by financing invasion and violent efforts to stain their lands red with blood, but rather by the process of negotiation and reason. We must understand, just as in Lebanon, and we all remember Lebanon, our well-intentioned but clumsy efforts to direct events by force of arms, bred only by resentment and hatred of the U.S. by these people. If we wanted to influence these people in the right direction, we would heed the leaders who understand the mores, the sensitivities, the conditions, and the great underlying strengths of their own society. We would not do it by presuming the right to dictate from Washington whom they choose to run their own country. Surely we have the right to insist that each such country would leave its neighbor in peace. Our friends in Latin America insist that this goal can best be achieved by the Contradora process, for the things that Latin Americans themselves are anxious to do to promote peace and democracy in the hemisphere and to influence Nicaragua within. As President Duarte and the democratic forces are demonstrating in El Salvador, the future lies not in military conquest, but in orderly democratic procedure.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Before I allocate the next one, I'd like to yield for a unanimous consent request.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in strong support of HJR 540 and ask for unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, and so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, it gives me pleasure to allocate 3 minutes. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Kemp, who is a member of the Kissinger Commission.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Kemp, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my friend from Michigan for yielding. Congress has been debating what to do on this issue each year since 1982. Communist oppression in Nicaragua has grown in that time. Soviet and Cuban arms shipments have risen. And the Sandinista government in Managua has reaffirmed several times its solidarity with Havana and Moscow. Last year, we voted humanitarian aid in the hopes of stimulating negotiations, and what happened? In October, all civil liberties were suspended. President Duarte's daughter was kidnapped by terrorist guerrillas, and we had to go to Nicaragua to negotiate her release. The resistance forces have been forced to retreat into Honduras and Costa Rica, chased by Soviet helicopter gunships. Today, President Reagan has come to the Congress with an urgent plea, a bipartisan plea for military assistance for the freedom fighters. Yet many of our colleagues urge a vote against his request, arguing that American policy should rest solely on negotiation. It should be clear by now that the Sandinistas see negotiation as a way to buy more time, to consolidate their totalitarian power over the church, the press, the schools, the people, the economy, and the military, and to starve the freedom fighters into submission. I wish the opponents of the bill would tell us what to do when the Marxist-Leninists in Managua turn their military force of subversion against Costa Rica with no army, or their neighboring countries and the fragile democracies in Central America, or to pursue what they call their revolution without borders. If Congress votes no today, this Congress will have put the lives of people, young people in particular, on the line for the sake of negotiation, political expediency, or the budget. What would the opponents of aid have the Contras do? Retreat, go back to Nicaragua, face imprisonment or death, or live in refugee camps, some part of Central America? It's all well and good to talk about compromise and more delay and reducing our options to negotiate, but there's more at stake here than the capacity of diplomats and government officials to work out talking points and working out drafts of peace in our times. But we cannot escape the fact that there are lives and freedoms and the hopes of that fragile democracy in Central America hanging in the balance as to how we vote today. Right now, we were elected to take these votes. We were elected to take this stand. We were told by the American people to support democracy with freedom and justice. We cannot escape this vote, and our vote will be recorded in history as to which side we're on. Let's give freedom a chance.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Trafficant.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Trafficant, is recognized for 1 minute.
Permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Here we go again. There's a problem. Throw some money at it. I haven't heard one committee chairman really come forward and give us a documented litany of facts surrounding this matter. We're here again under an air of emotionalism, and a lot of people are waving the flag, but whomever I've talked to in the last several months when asked this question, what happens if our $100 million bluff should fail? Every one of them says we're up a creek without a paddle. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to formulate policy, and $100 million is a Band-Aid. It's not going to treat the cancer in Central America. And we have been herded in here again on emotionalism, and we have yet to get any facts from this president. And I think that our committees, after we defeat this measure, should demand those facts if we have to close this House down, shut off C-SPAN, and give us a litany of facts showing what really is the case in Central America. I thank you for the time.
Time of the gentleman has
Ask
expired.
Danny Fasel.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Slatter.
The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Slatter, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in the spring of 1966, I graduated from high school in Atchison, Kansas. The war in Vietnam was heating up, and I was thinking about joining the Marine Corps. My dad was a Kansas farmer, and I can still remember him saying, "This war just doesn't make sense." Today, Mr. Chairman, we are debating another war in another place at another time. Once again, we are approaching a fateful decision that will escalate this war and escalate our commitment to it. But we are asked to act without consensus in this Congress and without hope, or at least much hope, of military success. We are asked to act without the support of the church and without the support of our people. And we are asked to act without the support of our democratic allies in Latin America. It just doesn't make sense. Mr. Chairman, we must have a bipartisan policy, and we do not have one today. The lesson of history is clear. As a nation, united we are strong, divided we are weak, and today we are divided. On February the 3rd, I joined with 30 other members in a letter to President Reagan. We urged him to postpone this Contra request. We urged him to work with the Latin democracies to search for peace and to work with Congress to search for consensus. Our advice was ignored. And then, only days later, 8 Latin foreign ministers came to Washington. They represented Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Uruguay. They urged the administration unanimously to withhold the Contra request and to support the Contadora process. They too were ignored. Mr. Chairman, we can develop a bipartisan policy, and we can agree on goals to contain communism, to no foreign military bases in Nicaragua, no military advisors, no interference with the other nations of the region, and human rights for the people of Nicaragua. But, Mr. Chairman, despite some of the gloom and doom rhetoric of this debate, one point is clear. Throughout Latin America, democracy is winning, totalitarianism is losing. Throughout the hemisphere, the trend to democracy is clear. The democracies are not surrounded by communists, the communists are surrounded by democracies. Will we work with or against these democracies? That is the question. And our answer must be a renewed commitment to these democracies. We must work with them diplomatically, politically, and even more important, we must help them economically. We should respect them and join them in a common effort based on common principles. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I hope we all understand that the proposal before us today does not have the support of the American people, does not have the support of our allies in Latin America or Europe, and does not have the support of the church. To pursue such a policy in our democracy just does not make sense.
Expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, for unanimous consent, I yield to Mr. Ritter.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I rise in strong support of this legislation.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Shelby.
The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Shelby, is recognized for 2 minutes without objection. 3 minutes without objection, it's so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we all know that we're at a historic point in our country. We've heard the debate. It's been going on for some 6, 7, 8 hours now. We know what the issue is on both sides. But I think the stage is set now to ask ourselves, what are we going to do? Are we going to abandon the Contras in Nicaragua as the world watches? Are we going to abandon it to Marxism forever? People talk about negotiating. Do you remember, any of you remember the Soviet Union negotiating in Poland, negotiating in Afghanistan? The answer to that is obvious. Do you really believe that they're going to negotiate in Nicaragua? I think the answer to that is rather obvious. All of us know that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries have orchestrated a massive flow of arms and material to Nicaragua, over $1 billion, perhaps much more. They've got a deep water port there capable of basing Soviet submarines. It's being constructed there. The largest military airfield in Central America is being built there. Do any of you believe those are massive public works projects? If you do, you just have to look back at Poland, at Afghanistan, and other areas. I think the central question before us today, are we really going to abandon hope that the people have in Nicaragua? Because if we don't send the aid, and people said, well, $100 million is not enough, I'll tell you, it's enough to keep it going now. It's enough to see where we're going, because there's been a lot of movement there. And I'll tell you all, let's not abandon the freedom fighters now. That's why I believe this is not a Republican vote or a Democratic vote. If we've ever had one, it should be a bipartisan vote. Let's send the money. We need to keep it going.
Gentleman, North Carolina, Mr. Neal, for unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also opposed to this aid package and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Richardson, is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection, it's so ordered.
Speaker, there are 4 things I wish to say on the eve of this vote. First, beware of letters and executive orders. If there's going to be a compromise, let it be in legislative language. As a victim of a letter that believed in that letter, I speak from experience. Secondly, we are spending too much time on this issue. There are other important national domestic priorities that we should be spending our time on. I wish the President could consider some other problems domestically that we have in our country. Thirdly, it is clear that the ads, and I was victim of radio ads, have backfired. They produced a 4-to-1 vote against the President after provoking these ads that are shameful, that question patriotism. I hope that's a lesson to be learned. Lastly, I think if this bill is defeated, the message to the President is not a rejection of his policies, but a rejection of the methodology of achieving his policy. If we reject the President's package, we can truly come up with a bipartisan